For decades, the world has been built on a fragile illusion, an illusion of stability, of predictable trade, of controlled conflict. Ships moved freely across oceans, oil flowed through narrow waterways without interruption, and global powers, despite their rivalries, maintained a delicate balance. But today, that balance is beginning to crack. From the deserts of the Middle East to the corridors of global power, something is shifting. Tensions between the United States and Iran are no longer just political disagreements. They are turning into something far more dangerous, far more unpredictable. Sanctions, military posturing, proxy conflicts, each move pushing the region closer to the edge. And at the center of it all lies one of the most important choke points on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water, just a few kilometers wide, yet responsible for carrying nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply. Every day, massive tankers pass through this corridor, fueling economies, powering industries, sustaining modern life. But what happens if that flow is disrupted? What happens when the artery of global energy is suddenly blocked? The consequences wouldn't just be regional, they would be global. Oil prices would skyrocket overnight, markets would panic, supply chains would collapse. From Asia to Europe, from factories to households, everyone would feel the shock, and this is no longer a distant possibility. In recent months, attacks on shipping vessels, rising military presence, and escalating rhetoric have made one thing clear: the risk is real. The world is entering a phase where uncertainty is becoming the new normal. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because in every global crisis, there are not just losers, there are also those who quietly gain importance. Not by fighting, not by dominating, but simply by being in the right place, at the right time. And that brings us to a country, often overlooked in global conversations, a country that rarely dominates headlines, yet sits at the crossroads of some of the most critical regions in the world: Pakistan. At first glance, it may not seem like the obvious focus of a global power shift. It struggles with economic challenges, faces internal political complexities, and is often viewed through the lens of instability rather than opportunity. But geography has a way of rewriting narratives. Look at the map closely. To the west lies Iran, to the north, China, to the northwest, Afghanistan and Central Asia, and to the south, the vast Arabian Sea, opening into the global trade network. This is not just a country, it is a corridor, a bridge between regions that shape the world's energy, trade, and politics. And in times of stability, this position is important. But in times of chaos, it becomes invaluable. Because when traditional routes become risky, the world starts looking for alternatives. When choke points become threats, new pathways suddenly matter. And this is where a name begins to surface more frequently in strategic discussions: Gwadar, a small coastal city located in Pakistan's Balochistan province. For years it has been described with ambitious labels: the next Dubai, a future global trade hub, a gateway to Central Asia. But for most of that time, those descriptions felt more like dreams than reality. Gwadar remained quiet, underdeveloped, far from the shining skylines of cities like Dubai, a place full of potential, but lacking momentum. So why is it suddenly being talked about again? Why are global analysts, strategists, and investors starting to pay closer attention? The answer lies not just in what Gwadar is, but in what it could become if the world continues down its current path. Because Gwadar is not just another port, its location is its power. Situated near the entrance of the Persian Gulf, it lies just outside the most volatile zone of maritime conflict, close enough to matter, but far enough to avoid immediate disruption. And in a scenario where the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable, this difference could change everything. Imagine a world where oil tankers hesitate to pass through risky waters, where insurance costs skyrocket, where delays become the norm. In such a world, alternative routes are no longer optional, they become essential, and suddenly, a quiet port like Gwadar begins to look very different. But Gwadar's importance doesn't stop there, because it is also a key piece of a much larger puzzle, a project that connects not just cities, but entire regions. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, often referred to as CPEC. This massive initiative aims to link Western China directly to the Arabian Sea through a network of roads, railways and pipelines. For China, this is a strategic breakthrough, because currently much of its energy imports travel through the Strait of Malacca, another vulnerable choke point, a long risky journey, exposed to geopolitical tensions. But Gwadar offers something different, a shorter, more secure route, one that bypasses traditional vulnerabilities, and in a world where global tensions are rising, this kind of alternative is not just valuable, it's critical. So now, the pieces start coming together: a volatile Middle East, uncertain trade routes, rising global tensions, and a strategically located port waiting to be utilized. It almost feels like a coincidence, but in geopolitics, coincidences are rare. Everything is connected, everything is calculated, and sometimes the biggest shifts happen quietly, before the world even realizes what's changing. But here's the question that makes this story truly intriguing. Is Pakistan simply getting lucky with its location, or is it slowly positioning itself to become a key player in a changing world order? Because being in the right place is only part of the equation. The real challenge is what you do with that position. History is filled with examples of countries that had strategic advantages but failed to capitalize on them, and others that turned geography into power. So where does Pakistan stand? Is it ready to transform potential into reality? Or is this just another narrative, driven by hope rather than facts? At this stage, the answer is not clear, and that uncertainty is what makes this story so compelling. Because on one hand, you have a world moving towards instability, and on the other, a country that could benefit from shifting dynamics. But nothing is guaranteed, and as we dig deeper into this story, a different picture begins to emerge, one that challenges the optimistic narrative, one that reveals the obstacles, the risks, and the harsh realities on the ground. Because behind every grand vision, there is always a truth that is far more complex. And in the case of Gwadar, that truth is impossible to ignore. In the next part, we move beyond the dream and step into the reality. A reality where development has been slower than expected, where local communities are raising questions, and where security concerns continue to cast a shadow over progress. Because before Pakistan can benefit from global chaos, it must first overcome its own internal challenges, and that is where the real story begins. But before Gwadar can become a symbol of opportunity, before Pakistan can rise as a strategic winner in a chaotic world, there is a reality that cannot be ignored, a reality that exists far away from maps, far away from global theories, and far away from the promises often repeated in headlines. Because on the ground, the story looks very different. Gwadar is not Dubai, at least not yet. There are no towering skyscrapers dominating the skyline, no bustling financial districts, no endless streams of global investors flooding the streets. Instead, there is silence, open land, unfinished infrastructure, and a pace of development that feels slower than expected. For years, Gwadar has been presented as the future, a city that would transform Pakistan's economy, a hub that would attract global trade and investment. But the question is, what happened? Why hasn't this transformation already taken place? The answer lies in a combination of challenges, some visible and others hidden beneath the surface. One of the most critical issues is infrastructure. A modern port city cannot function without the basics: water, electricity, road connectivity, and yet Gwadar has struggled with all three. Residents have at times faced severe water shortages, electricity supply has been inconsistent, basic urban facilities remain limited. For a project that aims to compete with global cities, these are not small problems, they are fundamental. Because no matter how strategic a location is, without infrastructure, potential remains just that, potential. But infrastructure is only part of the story. There is another challenge, one that is far more complex and far more sensitive: security. Balochistan, the province where Gwadar is located, has long experienced unrest. Over the years, there have been incidents targeting infrastructure projects, security forces, and even foreign workers involved in development initiatives. These incidents are not constant, but they are enough to create uncertainty. And in the world of global investment, uncertainty is a powerful deterrent. Because investors do not just look for opportunity, they look for stability. And when risks appear unpredictable, confidence begins to fade. This creates a cycle. Slow development leads to frustration. Frustration leads to instability. And instability slows development even further. Breaking this cycle is not easy. But perhaps the most important layer of this reality is the perspective of the people who live there, the local communities. For them, Gwadar is not a geopolitical project, it is home. And while the world talks about billions of dollars in investment, many locals have raised a simple question: where is the benefit for us? There have been concerns about access to basic resources, concerns about employment opportunities, concerns about whether development is inclusive or concentrated elsewhere. These concerns are not unique to Gwadar. They are common in large-scale development projects around the world. But if left unaddressed, they can become a serious obstacle, because development is not just about infrastructure, it is about people. And when people feel disconnected from progress, the foundation of that progress becomes fragile. So now, the image of Gwadar begins to shift, from a shining vision of the future to a complex reality filled with challenges, a place with enormous potential, but equally significant obstacles. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting, because despite all these challenges, the interest in Gwadar has not disappeared. In fact, in some ways, it is growing. Which raises an important question: why? Why would global powers continue to focus on a project that has yet to fully deliver on its promises? The answer, once again, lies beyond Gwadar itself. It lies in the changing dynamics of the world. Because while Gwadar faces internal challenges, the external environment is evolving in a way that could redefine its importance. As tensions in the Middle East continue to rise, as global trade routes become increasingly uncertain, and as competition between major powers intensifies, strategic locations begin to matter more than ever. And Gwadar, despite its current limitations, remains one of those locations. For China, it is not just about what Gwadar is today, it is about what it could become tomorrow. A direct access point to the Arabian Sea, a way to reduce dependence on vulnerable trade routes, a long-term strategic asset, and China is known for thinking in decades, not months. Which means short-term challenges may not be enough to shift its long-term vision. But China is not the only player watching. Other regional powers are also aware of Gwadar's potential, because in geopolitics, no strategic location goes unnoticed. And when one country invests heavily in a region, others begin to pay attention. Some may see opportunity, others may see risk, but either way, Gwadar is no longer invisible. It is part of a larger conversation, a conversation about trade routes, energy security, and global influence. And this is where the contrast becomes even sharper. On one side, a city still struggling with basic challenges. On the other, a location that could play a key role in the future of global trade. It almost feels like two different realities, existing at the same time. And the truth is, both are real. Gwadar is both, a project that has yet to fully succeed, and a location that remains strategically valuable. Which brings us back to the central mystery of this story. Can potential overcome reality? Can long-term strategy outweigh short-term challenges? Or will the obstacles prove too difficult to overcome? Because if Gwadar cannot stabilize, cannot develop, cannot build trust and infrastructure, then even the most favorable global conditions may not be enough. Opportunity alone is not success. Execution is. And this is where Pakistan's role becomes critical. Because ultimately, Gwadar is not just a global project. It is a national responsibility. The decisions made today, the policies implemented, the way challenges are addressed, will determine whether Gwadar becomes a success story or a missed opportunity. But just as this reality creates doubt, it also sets the stage for something else. Because sometimes, it is not perfect conditions that create breakthroughs. It is pressure. It is urgency. It is the kind of global shift that forces change to happen faster than expected. And that is exactly what may be unfolding right now. Because as the world moves deeper into uncertainty, as traditional systems begin to strain, and as new alliances and routes are explored, countries are being pushed to adapt, to act, to reposition themselves. And in that kind of environment, even places that once seemed unlikely can suddenly become essential. So the question is no longer just about Gwadar's current state. The question is, what happens if the world changes faster than Gwadar does? What happens if global powers need alternatives before perfect conditions are achieved? And what happens if Pakistan finds itself in a position where it is needed, not because it is fully ready, but because there are no better options. That is where the story takes its most unexpected turn, because in geopolitics, timing can be just as powerful as preparation. And sometimes, history does not wait for perfection. It moves forward, and those in the right place are pulled into its momentum. In the next part, we explore that possibility. A scenario where global conflict, energy crises, and shifting alliances create an environment where Pakistan's role begins to expand. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, and then all at once. Because if the world continues on its current path, Gwadar may not need to become Dubai to become important, and Pakistan may not need to be perfect to become relevant. The real question is, how far can that relevance go? History rarely announces its turning points. There are no warnings, no clear signals, no moment where the world simply stops and says, everything is about to change. Instead, it happens quietly. A shift in trade, a disruption in supply, a conflict that spreads just far enough to force the world to adapt. And before anyone fully realizes it, the balance of power begins to move. That is the kind of moment the world may be entering right now. Because if tensions between the United States and Iran continue to escalate, if the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable, or even partially disrupted, the consequences will not just reshape the Middle East, they will reshape global priorities. Energy security will become urgent, trade routes will be reassessed, and countries that were once considered secondary will suddenly become essential. This is where the story returns to Pakistan, not as a dominant power, not as a country leading global decisions, but as something far more subtle, a country that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Because in a world where traditional routes are under threat, alternatives are no longer optional, they are necessary. And Gwadar, despite all its challenges, offers exactly that. An alternative, not a perfect one, not a fully developed one, but a real one. And in times of crisis, good enough can be more valuable than perfect but unavailable. Imagine a scenario where oil shipments through the Gulf face delays, where shipping companies begin to look for safer pathways, where global powers start exploring backup options. In such a scenario, even partial functionality becomes an advantage. Gwadar does not need to replace major ports overnight. It only needs to become useful. And once something becomes useful in geopolitics, it begins to grow in importance. Slowly at first, and then rapidly. Because with increased usage comes increased investment. With investment comes development. And with development comes influence. This is how transformation happens, not in a single moment, but through a chain reaction. And this is where Pakistan's potential advantage begins to take shape, not as a guaranteed outcome, but as a possibility that is becoming harder to ignore. Because Gwadar is only one part of the equation, the real advantage lies in something bigger. Geography. Pakistan sits at a point where multiple regions intersect. The Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, and China. In stable times, this position is important, but in unstable times, it becomes critical, because when direct routes become risky, indirect routes gain value, and Pakistan offers something that few countries can: connectivity, land routes linking ports to inland regions, access to markets that are otherwise difficult to reach, and proximity to some of the world's most important energy sources. This creates opportunities across multiple levels: economic, strategic, diplomatic. Let's start with the economic dimension. If Gwadar begins to see increased activity, even at a modest scale, it can trigger a ripple effect. Logistics networks expand, transport industries grow, supporting infrastructure begins to develop, jobs are created, local economies start to shift, and investment begins to follow demand. But this is not automatic. It depends on how effectively these opportunities are managed. Because without proper planning, growth can remain uneven, and the benefits can fail to reach those who need them most. Which brings us to the internal challenge. For Pakistan to truly benefit, development must be inclusive, infrastructure must improve, not just in Gwadar, but across connected regions. Local communities must see real opportunities, not just promises, because without internal stability, external advantages lose their impact. Now consider the diplomatic dimension. In a world divided by conflict, countries that can maintain relationships across different blocs gain a unique kind of influence. Pakistan has historically balanced relationships with multiple powers: China, the United States, Middle Eastern countries. This balancing act is not always easy, and it is not always perfect, but in times of global tension, it becomes valuable, because when communication breaks down between rivals, intermediaries become important. Countries that can engage with multiple sides can play roles that are not always visible, but are strategically significant. This is not about dominating global politics, it is about being relevant within it. And relevance is a form of power. Then there is the strategic and military dimension, not in the sense of direct conflict, but in terms of positioning, naval routes, port access, regional security dynamics. As global powers look to secure their interests, locations like Gwadar gain attention, not necessarily as military bases, but as logistical points, as nodes within a larger network. And once again, this attention brings investment, infrastructure, security improvements, strategic partnerships, each step reinforcing the next. But here is where the story becomes more complex. Because every advantage comes with risk. As Pakistan's importance grows, so does the pressure. Pressure from global powers, each with their own interests. Pressure from regional dynamics, which can shift quickly. And pressure from within, as expectations rise. Because being strategically important is not always comfortable. It requires careful decisions, balanced policies, and the ability to navigate competing interests. One wrong move can shift the balance, and this is why the idea of Pakistan as a winner in global conflict is not as simple as it sounds, because winning in this context does not mean dominating. It means managing opportunity without being overwhelmed by it. It means growing in importance without becoming a battleground for competing powers, and that is a delicate balance. So where does this leave us? On one hand, a world moving towards uncertainty. On the other, a country with a unique position in that uncertainty. A country that could benefit, but only under the right conditions. And that brings us back to the original question: is Pakistan quietly positioning itself to gain from global chaos? Or is it simply in the right place, at a very unpredictable time? The answer is not absolute, because the future is not determined by geography alone. It is shaped by decisions, by preparation, by execution, by the ability to adapt when circumstances change. Gwadar may never become Dubai, at least not in the way people imagine, but perhaps that was never the real goal, because in a changing world, being a luxury hub is not the only path to importance. Being a strategic connector, a critical link in global systems, can be just as powerful, and sometimes even more so. So maybe the real story is not about replacing Dubai, maybe it is about redefining what success looks like. In a world where stability is no longer guaranteed, and where new routes, new alliances, and new priorities are emerging, countries like Pakistan are being given an opportunity, not a guaranteed victory, not a predetermined future, but an opportunity. And in geopolitics, opportunities like this do not come often. The question is, will Pakistan recognize it? Will it act on it? Or will it remain a story of potential that never fully materializes? Because as history continues to move forward, as conflicts reshape the global landscape, the silent shifts happening today may define the world of tomorrow, and when that future arrives, we may look back at this moment and realize that the biggest changes were already in motion, quietly, unnoticed, and right in front of us.